You're joining us for a webinar on nuclear disarmament and arms control, the state of play. And these questions, of course, are as pertinent as ever today. And we have a great panel with us to explore those questions. My name is Sibylle Bauer. I'm Director of Studies for Armament and Disarmament at SIPRI. And I'm also the Working Group Chair on Nuclear Disarmament in Policy and International Law at the Alva Myrdal Centre at Uppsala University. So the center was established this year, but the issue of nuclear disarmament has, of course, a very long history in Sweden. And I'm very pleased to have with us today the chair of the board of the Alva Myrdal Centre, Cecilia Wikström, who is a former member of the Swedish Parliament and also a former member of the European Parliament. So over to you, Cecilia, for introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Cecilia Wikström. I'm the chair of the board of directors for the very recently established Alva Myrdal Centre for Nuclear Disarmament at Uppsala University. I'm very grateful to SIPRI, the organizers of this webinar, and happy to meet all of you digitally this afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank SIPRI for being so welcoming to our new center, and especially warm thanks to Dr. Bauer for all hard work for organizing this webinar, and thanks also for our already so fruitful cooperation. Forums like ours are particularly important given that many of the problems related to nuclear weapons are becoming more and more acute by the day. Please allow me also, as the Alva Myrdal Centre is still quite new, to briefly introduce to you its ambitions and the organization of it. The center was established this year, 2021, at Uppsala University to provide teaching, research, and policy support on nuclear disarmament. Alva Myrdal Centre studies the whole process in which nuclear disarmament occurs. That is, preconditions and hurdles, negotiations and decision-making, implementation and verification. It is organized as a transdisciplinary center and contains experts in many fields of academia, such as peace and conflict research, applied nuclear physics, and international law. In cooperation with other stakeholders, the center disseminates knowledge of nuclear disarmament by holding and hosting conferences and workshops. It also aims at raising public awareness about nuclear disarmament and contributes thereby to the public debate. In terms of education, Alva Myrdal Centre organizes courses about nuclear disarmament that are part of regular university teaching, as well as independent specialized courses. The first priority in terms of education is to develop and present an advanced course in technical nuclear verification of nuclear disarmament with a focus on applied nuclear physics with additional cross-disciplinary elements. The first iteration of this course is aimed at doctoral students and will be given in the spring already next year. Solid research is the basis on which all AMC activities will be built. A new tenured chair in nuclear disarmament will be created, and PhD students and guest researchers will be hosted. Another task is to coordinate working groups jointly with international researchers for interdisciplinary research on different aspects of nuclear disarmament. At present, the following groups already exist, and I will read them out to you just for you to see the magnitude. Negotiating nuclear disarmament, international measures for compliance to nuclear disarmament regimes, data on nuclear rivalries, negotiations and agreements, technical nuclear non-proliferation and safeguards, nuclear disarmament in policy and international law, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And they are already up and running. In addition to education and research, the center will cooperate with government agencies, civil society organizations to facilitate dissemination of research findings, as well as exchange of knowledge and experience. AMC is a knowledge center within the Uppsala University, and as such, the center does not adopt positions on policy issues, but we do encourage researchers to be active in the public debate. When invited, the center will provide advice to policy work on the basis of research results. Now, I gather some of you may wonder, how is this center financed? Well, the task was given by the Swedish government to Uppsala University after an evaluation by the Swedish Research Council, assisted by the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority and the Swedish Defense Research Agency. Thus, the AMC is supported by funds from the Swedish national budget and Uppsala University jointly. Let me also briefly explain the name of the center. It is named after Alva Myrdal, who was born in Uppsala in 1902. She was a former student of the Uppsala University as she became an internationally renewed disarmament negotiator and shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1982 with Alfonso García Robles. So, having tried to explain our mission briefly to you, please allow me also to widen the scope a bit. Few would probably dispute that nuclear weapons represent an existential threat to humanity. Climate change is probably the only other threat of the same level and magnitude. But like climate change, the use of nuclear weapons represent an enormously complex set of interrelated issues and problems, each of which requires better understanding and, of course, custom-made remedies. Some examples include nuclear war by accident, perhaps triggered by advances in technologies that reduce time for decision-making, proliferation of nuclear weapons and preventive wars to hinder proliferation, and nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists. And there is even some studies that suggest that the use of nuclear weapons might even affect the global climate change. And even social issues can be relating to nuclear weapons when huge sums of money are invested in weapons instead of providing welfare services such as schooling and healthcare to its citizens. I am convinced that the participants of this webinar today, and especially the knowledgeable speakers, can provide useful perspectives and thus contribute to finding possible ways ahead for all of us. There are numerous of research centers, NGOs, governmental organizations, and committed individuals who have committed to working on the problem of nuclear weapons. Among them, of course, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and you stand out as one of the most important actors. Now, we at Alva Myrdal Centre, we hope to develop the new center together with all committed actors, like all of you participating in this webinar today, in the spirit of Alva Myrdal, the great Swede who has given her name to our center. And by this introductory words and the introduction of the new center, I thank you very much for your attention and wish all of you a very fruitful continuation of this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And of course, we at SIPRI very much look forward to working with AMC going forward. It's not just the focus on nuclear disarmament that connects us, but also the joint linkage to Alva Myrdal, who also was very much at the core of the foundation of SIPRI. So with that, let me move over to our distinguished panel, and I would like to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. I will start with Ambassador Sergei Batsanov, who's now the director of the Pugwash office in Geneva, but has a very distinguished career in the diplomatic service, initially of the Soviet Union and then later of Russia. For example, as a representative in Geneva in the Conference on Disarmament, and having been involved in many, many different formats and mechanisms in nuclear disarmament and arms control. We are very lucky to have you join us here. Then we have Matt Korda, who works for the Federation of American Scientists and is also a research associate with SIPRI. Matt is working on the nuclear notebook with Hans Christensen, and he's also part of the core team at SIPRI producing the nuclear forces data. Then we have Professor Sharon Squassoni, who is a research professor at George Washington University and held a number of previous positions at very distinguished institutions such as CSIS, the Carnegie Endowment, and also the Congressional Research Service. Welcome, Sharon. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Tong Chao, who is a senior fellow with the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing, and is also on the board of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So welcome to our panel. And I should also say to the audience that we will first do a few rounds of discussion with the panel, and then there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And for that, I would like to ask you to use the Q&A box that you have at your disposal. I will then select some of the questions and put them to our panel. I would like to start the discussion with Matt. In very good SIPRI tradition, we would like to start with the data. So could you summarize the main trends and developments in world nuclear forces? And when you do so, I would like you to in particular also talk about the impact of New START on holdings and nuclear postures in Russia and in the US. And also, I know you've done a lot of work on nuclear modernization in China and also doctrine development. So please address all those aspects. Over to you, Matt.
Sure, thank you so much. Thanks for all of you for being here, and to SIPRI and the Alva Myrdal Centre for having me on to speak with you all. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. So as Sibylla mentioned, in addition to my role at SIPRI, I make up one half of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, along with my colleague Hans Christensen. And the goal of that project is to kind of pull back the curtain on excessive nuclear secrecy and empower the public with factual information about nuclear weapons policy and operations in order to challenge assumptions and improve accountability. And so to that end, we try and produce the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear arsenals and trends by analyzing information from a wide variety of open sources. And we publish that information in the nuclear chapters of the SIPRI yearbook. And so since we're nearing the end of this year, Hans and I are currently kind of neck deep in the number crunching to produce our end of 2021 global nuclear force estimates. And I was asked to provide some perspective with regards to how those trends are looking as we compile those numbers. So I guess I would start by saying that if you look purely at how the total number of nuclear weapons in the world is changing from year to year, I think you'd be forgiven for thinking that the disarmament picture is a lot better than it actually is. Each year, the overall number of nuclear warheads in the world declines on a relatively steady basis. However, that's mostly because of the United States and Russia dismantling a couple hundred retired warheads each year. That is really where the good news ends from a disarmament perspective, unfortunately. Both the United States and Russia, as well as pretty much every single other nuclear armed state, are in the middle of expensive and extensive nuclear modernization campaigns as they replace many of their Cold War era legacy systems with newer systems. And in reality, and in kind of stark contradiction to the total number of nuclear weapons that exist in the world, the number of nuclear weapons in global military stockpiles, which generally refers to the number of operational nuclear weapons, that number is actually increasing. And that's unfortunately a global phenomenon that applies, again, to nearly every single nuclear armed state. And of particular interest to this audience, I think, is how does this apply to China, Russia, and the United States? And we can kind of go through those quickly in turn. So this past year, the public gained a new understanding of how China is expanding its nuclear force, not only by constructing several hundreds of new missile silos, but also by beginning to deploy the first brigades of its new mobile DF-41 ICBM. Additionally, 2 new ballistic missile submarines also joined the Chinese Navy in 2021. And so we estimate that China currently has approximately 350 warheads in its operational stockpile. And although this is, kind of roughly the same number that we've been working with for the past couple of years, we estimate that for the first time, it seems that all of these warheads are now assigned to systems that have newly become operational, as opposed to systems that are kind of still in production. Moving on to Russia, despite the decline in the kind of total nuclear inventory in 2021, Russia continued its long-running modernization campaign with the goal of replacing all of its Soviet-era systems with more modern ones. Its nuclear triad is now, it seems that it's nearing approximately 90% modern weapons and equipment. And we estimate that stockpile includes roughly about 4,500 warheads. And the current kind of emphasis of the Russian modernization program is on the deployment of the new Yars ICBM, as well as adding additional ballistic missile submarines to its fleet and deploying new non-strategic dual-capable systems. With regards to the United States, although that stockpile is remaining roughly steady at approximately 3,700 warheads, the United States is modernizing basically every single nuclear delivery system and basically every single warhead in its arsenal. In 2021, the US progressed with its development of the ground-based strategic deterrent, the B-21 bomber, the Columbia-class submarine, the long-range standoff weapon, and a variety of other nuclear delivery systems. And this past year, the US also completed its final drop test of the new B-6112 gravity bomb, preparing it for eventual deployment in bases in the United States and Europe. What this all kind of adds up to is that the trend that we've been seeing since the end of the Cold War, in which countries have been steadily trying to reduce the number and the role of nuclear weapons in their military stockpiles, that trend now appears to have come to a halt, and in many cases is actually being reversed. And so, what is driving those changes? I would say a variety of intersecting factors, one of which is the fact that these modernization campaigns are being driven by the global competitive environment that is actively being embraced by the nuclear armed states, which is resulting in this kind of destabilizing, action-reaction security dynamic that we're seeing. In particular, I would say it's possible to draw a thread between the unrestricted development of defensive systems and the new developments in offensive systems that we're seeing, particularly with regards to Russia and China. So, for example, in March 2018, Russia unveiled its new suite of developmental nuclear delivery systems, which many build as kind of exotic nuclear delivery systems. What's notable about those systems is that 5 out of 6 of them are specifically designed to evade missile defenses, right? Or to play a supporting role in other systems, evasive maneuvers. Additionally, in recent years, China has taken steps to equip both its ICBMs and SLBMs with multiple warheads in order to ensure that they can continue to kind of penetrate missile defense systems. In recent years, we've also seen, I think, the decline and just kind of general disinterest in arms control writ large. New START was, I think, thankfully rescued from kind of the brink at the very last minute. And the treaty is doing its part to keep many hundreds of US and Russian warheads in storage under normal circumstances rather than deployed. But it's incredibly difficult to imagine what a follow-on treaty would look like without, in particular, without Washington being willing to put its defensive systems, which is kind of the biggest elephant in the arms control room, for lack of a better metaphor, on the table. And I think there's some very significant political roadblocks to doing so, but the security gains would outweigh those costs. So I'll leave it there for now, because I think we're going to get into all those issues a lot more during the discussion, but I'm looking forward to it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Matt, for setting the scene. And let me now turn to the other three panelists and ask for your assessment of the state of play regarding nuclear disarmament and arms control. What are the challenges? What are the obstacles in advancing further? And how are the key institutions dealing with these challenges? And I would like to start with Ambassador Batsanov. And I would like to invite you to include two aspects in particular in your remarks. First of all, on Russia-US arms control, your assessment of the strategic stability dialogue, and also New START. What are the chances of negotiating a successor agreement in deeper cuts, and what are the risks of not doing so? And also, could you please comment on the risks and opportunities of the forthcoming NPT review conference in January, and also the first meeting of the states parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Cecile. It's a huge agenda that you are putting on me. Indeed, so many aspects. But before I start trying to respond to your questions, I'd like to congratulate the new Alva Myrdal Centre. I joined or started dealing with arms control disarmament in the late 60s, early 70s as a student, and then from mid-70s as a young diplomat. And this was one of the first sort of great names I was told about by my professors and superiors in the foreign ministry. And of course, Sweden was also famous for other very great leaders like Inga Thorsson as well. So congratulations with the center, and I wish the center all the best in its work, all the success. Now, frankly, the current situation with nuclear arms control and disarmament, for me, is a cause of great concern. I think we have a combination of various factors, many of which lie beyond the traditional, let's say, scenarios for arms control per se, or disarmament, or elimination of weapons. Of course, one has really to think hard in order to overcome the current trends which have already been mentioned. I would even say that while it seemed by early 1990s, mid-1990s even, that we collectively succeeded in implementing, or almost succeeded in implementing, one part of Article 6 of the NPT, the first part, which is stopping the nuclear arms race. Now, nuclear disarmament is something more complicated, but at least we could think that we have almost stopped it. Now we are back to the nuclear arms race. So among the factors, I think, are geopolitical, and that is caused by the unforeseen before redistribution of economic power, financial power, wealth, which inevitably translates and will translate itself even in even greater terms into ability to run and manage global processes. Now, you often hear that Russia is resurging, China is on the way to becoming a superpower, not just in economic, financial terms, but in military terms. But in addition to that, I think we have other growing concentrations of power in the world. in several other countries, maybe smaller. Well, India is not, of course, a small country anyway, but maybe smaller countries which see this redistribution and the number of social and economic problems that are in abundance, let's say, in the old centers of power, as a reason for them to cut out better piece or pieces for themselves. Maybe more in regional terms, maybe in some local terms, but this competition is really growing. Second, a revolution in military applications of new technologies. There are many. There are hypersonic delivery vehicles. There are systems based on and which employ artificial intelligence. And here I am even more concerned about globalization of artificial intelligence in and their military applications, rather than, you know, individual weapons or weapon systems that can themselves decide whom to shoot and who can be spared. It's much more than that, because that changes the whole set of earlier accepted patterns about situational analysis, prevention of nuclear war, readiness of retaliatory nuclear forces, and so on and so forth. Another element here is that the same changes in technology have already started to amalgamate nuclear and non-nuclear forces. In other terms, and this is from a technical point of view, the functions, the military functions, that in the past could only be assigned to a nuclear weapon system, not all of them yet, but more and more they can be assigned to, let's say, a missile, very precise missile, very fast flying missile, very capable missile without a nuclear warhead. In the sense that such categories of weapons increasingly represent a threat to nuclear retaliatory forces. So this is, by the way, in addition to what Matt Korda mentioned about defensive systems, missile defense in the first place. Now, these systems are not defensive, they are attack systems, offensive systems. They don't use nuclear warheads, and they still can provoke a nuclear war. And fears of losing the nuclear arsenal in one or another nuclear weapon state, therefore heightening the risk of nuclear holocaust. Another trend, which is of great concern to me in this connection as well, is increasing erosion of the rule of law. The norms you can hear more and more often. There are certain norms that come from the long past and maybe not so relevant now. Now we need to have new norms, which may be more important than old norms. That is extrapolated to key international institutions, including the UN and its charter and the Security Council, and to a whole range of treaties. Interestingly, and jumping a little bit forward, since your questions included the NPT review conference, I was struck by two articles quite recently by rather well-known authors, actually declaring that the NPT is becoming, probably not become yet, but is becoming a treaty of the past, because the conditions are different and so on and so forth. And also, these new technologies combined with increased rivalry lead and the deterioration of rule of law lead to two other things. On a, let's say, mental or psychological basis, but it also matters, because prevention of nuclear war, deterrence with all the mess that this term entails and different interpretations, they all have a good percentage of psychological aspects. And the feeling of mutual vulnerability is going away. The inadmissibility of nuclear war is something that is going away, not in the sense that massive use of nuclear weapons could be tolerated and sustained, but perhaps ways can be found to fight a nuclear war in a new way, in a more humane way, with, let's say, nuclear warheads of much lower yield, using all that much more carefully and so on and so forth. In my view, that's nonsense, but it is creating a certain mindset. And this is also very dangerous. Of course, the prolongation of the New START, which was actually became possible just a couple of days before the treaty was to expire, and thanks to the fact that Biden became the president of the United States, was of course a very welcome development, because it allowed to keep a certain degree of stability and gained time for subsequent efforts to think about something that would eventually replace it. But here again, we still have a lot of unclarities. After Geneva meeting between this June between Presidents Putin and Biden, Russia and the US agreed to start strategic stability discussions. They are going on. My understanding is that the sides are bringing quite serious and multi-agency delegations discussing a lot of concerns, but so far it is a presentation of concerns, and it hasn't yet reached even the stage of trying to put the concerns somehow in a common in a common plate, or on a common plate, and start engineering solutions. And I don't know how long that would last. And of course, the bilateral relations between Russia and the US is extremely nervous, confrontational. I think that people responsible for strategic stability discussions and talks are trying to keep them separate, but the question is for how long that would be possible. And interestingly so, relations between the US and China are also not in the best shape. This, in my view, is creating a not so rosy background for the NPT review conference, which had been delayed, of course, for other reasons a couple of times. There we have a number of confrontational lines between at least some of the P5s, so-called recognized nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT, or among them, between countries in one or another way allied with the nuclear weapon states, not all of them, and the rest of the membership, between those who believe that the newly entered into force treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is something that everyone should applaud, and those who believe that it is a kind of an anathema leading to or invented to destroy the NPT. Therefore, I frankly could not understand when so many people in the run-up to the review conference were talking about let's have or how we can have a successful review conference. I didn't see it. A more modest, I think, expectation or approach is necessary. I'm happy it was understood by the drafters of the P5 communique on the NPT review conference, which the P5s adopted at their meeting in Paris just at the very beginning of this month. And so there they talk about meaningful results. I think that's possible. So moderation, the understanding that the health of NPT and its future should be considered as something more important than scoring propaganda victories and playing zero-sum games. If this happens, if the ambitions are not high and dedication to having constructive session is high, on the other hand, I think we can have some modest results. Unfortunately, the P5 do not or have very little to offer at this point in time to the review conference in terms of arms control and disarmament. Nuclear posture review in the United States probably would not even be completed. An attempt to convince the UK and France to join in some appropriate, with some appropriate language, United States, Russia, and China, who share now, all three of them, the principle that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The attempts to convince the UK and France about the need to do the same or join forces with the other three didn't work out. I'm happy that the P5 were able to mention the need to put the CTBT into force. I'm also happy that they were able to agree on the need to start negotiations on FMCT in the Conference on Disarmament, which shows, which is sending a kind of an encouraging signal that they are able to talk seriously to each other and to agree on certain points. But overall, the ambition is not so high, and it remains to be seen whether what the P5 included in their statement, positive things here and there, hopefully that P5 statement can become a skeleton of a kind of a final document or statement or declaration or what have you. But whether it will be enough remains to be seen. I suspect that some negotiations, maybe very hot negotiations, would be needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very thoughtful and insightful remarks. I'd like now to turn to Tong Chao. Please feel free to also react to the previous speakers in your remarks now. And I would like to invite you to give your assessment on the current state of play on nuclear disarmament and arms control, in particular also to address China's nuclear force posture and China's perception of bilateral US-Russian arms control processes. And the question that is often asked, if and how China would like to engage in a strategic dialogue or arms control discussions with Russia and with the United States. So over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you so much. I think the biggest challenge for arms control, or to put it another way, the greatest driver of the emerging arms race is the intensified geopolitical struggle among the major powers, including their rising ideological confrontation. The conventional wisdom is nuclear weapons help stabilize the relations among major powers, prevent conflicts from happening. And therefore, because of nuclear weapons, the major powers have no need to really address their political disagreements. I think the reality shows that it's the opposite. In fact, despite the existence of nuclear weapons, their rising political disagreements are actually causing the nuclear weapon states to enhance their nuclear capabilities. There is an emerging nuclear arms competition. The risk of nuclear conflict becomes greater. So I think we have to, the major nuclear powers, they have to address this most fundamental driver of their arms race, which is to face and to manage their rising geopolitical disagreements and their ideological confrontation. I think in the case of China, of course, the government hasn't said much about the motivations behind its apparent nuclear expansion, but existing evidence indicates that the Chinese political leadership is attaching greater importance to nuclear weapons. The Chinese paramount leader says the nuclear forces are a key pillar of China's international status. There is growing mainstream view that a greater nuclear force could help China push back against the perceived political hostility from the United States. They think nuclear weapons can make Western countries better respect China. So they are assigning a greater political value to nuclear forces. And China is also putting its resources and its industrial capacity to the nuclear field, to the construction of hundreds of new ICBM silos. Falls into this logic of making the best of China's unique advantage in building massive industrial infrastructure. In the Chinese case, compared with some of other countries, there is much less internal checks and balances. The national decision power is increasingly concentrated under one person. There is no internal scrutiny over the military or the defense industry. That makes it more likely that even though China's self-perceived objective is perhaps defensive, but at the operational level, the military, the defense industry is likely to push for the development of excessive capabilities that would overkill in terms of countering the perceived threat. and the impact of North Korea's nuclear program, the emergence of new technologies like missile defense, are only providing even greater room for the major powers to disagree about how much each other is justified to enhance their nuclear capabilities. So they are facing this new challenge of incorporating new factors like missile defense, conventional strike weapons, cyber technology, and AI into a much more complex nuclear equilibrium equation. And so that's, I think, adding difficulty to maintaining nuclear stability. In the case of China, I do think China's current nuclear buildup has included a serious consideration about at which point China would participate in arms limitation or arms reduction negotiations. It looks like its current buildup is simply for the goal of bolstering China's nuclear deterrent, to narrow the gap with other major powers, to gain political leverage against perceived American strategic hostility, and to help achieve national rejuvenation. It's often heard that good arms control is to control others' capabilities. And the Chinese government has not acknowledged it. The reported development of nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities. So it is hard to imagine that China would participate in nuclear limitation or reduction negotiation anytime soon. And I think China in the foreseeable future is likely to take a step-by-step approach, build up its capability to certain levels, and take stock and see what US and Russia has been doing, and then make the next decision. So if things go well, we may see two parallel bilateral strategic stability talks. There is already the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue, hopefully following the US-China leader virtual summit. There will be also a similar US-China strategic stability discussion in which both sides can address a comprehensive set of issues that affect the nuclear equation. To the United States, the worry is with China's nuclear expansion in the future, the US has to worry about integration of Chinese and Russian nuclear capabilities. There may be closer coordination and even cooperation in Chinese and Russian nuclear operation and posture and employment strategy. So that would seriously disrupt the current US-Russia bilateral arms control process. In reality, I think it is hard for for China and Russia to engage in very deep nuclear integration and coordination, because neither country, neither Russia nor China, is very keen to share military secrets with other countries. And at the end of the day, there is no genuine trust between the two countries. They both embrace some suspicion against each other. But the U.S. might still consider Chinese and Russian capabilities together. So that's another major challenge for a global arms control agenda. On the other hand, I think there is always internal Chinese and Russian competition. Both countries see the United States as the source of trouble, and they want to draw the trouble to the other country, so to speak, which means if the US-China competition becomes more intense, that might help the US-Russia bilateral arms control framework in some sense. But given their complex interactive relationship, of course, a trilateral arms some sort of trilateral arms control process would make sense. And I think it would even make sense for China because Russia and China can support each other and they share important interests and concerns against the United States. But the Chinese government has made a very strong and firm position against trilateral arms control. So we will only wait and see whether China can reverse that position. I think I've been going on for too long, but I think for the near-term future, even though arms limitation and reduction talks are unlikely to involve China, we can still push for softer or behavioral arms control, including discussions on crisis management and other issues. We also shouldn't underestimate the impact of internal factors. We know that the China's massive nuclear expansion program started when China's economy was at its peak. But today, the Chinese economy is already in a very different shape and may face growing challenges, if not existential threats. So maybe internal economic recession or other instability could seriously affect the current trajectory of China's nuclear program. At the end of the day, it is possible that it is not arms race, it is not arms control that saves us from this dangerous arms race, but internal problems, implosions of some sort, like the Cold War. So that's, I think, another possibility for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tang, for those really fascinating insights. And I'd like to now turn to Sharon Squassoni. Sharon, how do things look like from Washington? What's your assessment of the state of play? And I would also like to invite you to react to the previous speakers and share your assessments of engaging China and engaging Russia, making further cuts and advancing in terms of arms control disarmament. Over to you.
Thank you, Sibylla, and thank you. The panel has been fascinating so far. It's hard to know what to pick up on, but let me just thank SIPRI and the Alva Myrdal Centre. I will say that, you know, as a young arms controller at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, I used to pore over the negotiating record of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the most illuminating parts of that were the questions that Alva Myrdal placed to the other negotiators. It really was a kind of formative experience to me. So I'm glad that this new center has been established, and I really look forward to seeing a lot of great things come out of it. I think the previous speakers have sort of highlighted on all the important parts, right? Arms control and disarmament is going to get a lot more complex from a technological perspective because of the overlaps between all these different domains, space, cyber, AI. You know, the geopolitical context right now shows us that we also can't just focus on nuclear. That is what is happening in the conventional spheres. You know, I have to say, you know, Russian troops massing on the Ukrainian border could make, if not nuclear, while it makes nuclear arms control even more important, it also makes it politically very difficult. That's not to say the US is blameless in any of this. I'm sure that the reactions to this recent deal of sharing nuclear submarine technology with Australia has not made other folks very happy. But we face several challenges, right? Matt spoke about the modernization programs. Yes, there are some destabilizing developments along there. Arms control could actually usefully focus on you know, trade-offs between some of those weapon systems. But the reality, and I think Tong
pointed to this, at least in the US, some of these modernization programs have been underway for a long, long time. They're very hard to turn off. One of the problems that the US faces in trading off potentially some of its defensive systems, right, missile defenses, is that these programs have been kind of sewn into the fabric of American political life in terms of defense contracts for, 40, 50 years, 40 years at least. And at a time politically in the United States where the margins of support for the Biden administration to do a wide range of things is very slim. So I think we have perhaps a window here, but it's not much to work with. The good news is that I think this new administration in the United States wants to do the right thing, but it faces significant challenges. So you've seen recently, we're back to more transparent actions about our stockpile, right? So we released some information about that. I know it seems like a minor thing, but it is a signpost that the US, this administration, respects the need to share information, right? That might make other countries a little uncomfortable at the NPT review conference. We've had a long debate with Russia and China about transparency over stockpiles, fissile material, nuclear weapons. I don't know whether there will be any push to enhance transparency as there have been at previous NPT RevCons, but even small adjustments could be helpful. One of the questions I have for, I guess, both Tong and Matt moving forward is, there's a lot of rhetoric in the United States. There's almost this, I don't want to call it hysteria, that's too strong a word, but about, China's modernization, and it could double, triple its stockpile. Well, one thing that China could usefully do would be to release or share information about fissile material stockpiles, right? Because, weapons don't just materialize out of thin air, right? You need fissile material to granted, it's not all that much, but you need fissile material to enhance that stockpile. So that would be helpful. I think that Tong's assessment is right on the money. I think arms control is not in the near-term future between the US and China for all of the reasons he mentioned and obvious, but crisis stability is really, really important. I think in the case of the US-Russia relationship, that arms control for a long time has been like the last avenue for us to discuss issues of mutual interest. It's so imperative that that continues. And the extension of New START to 2026 provides a guardrail, but stepping back and looking at the entire picture, it is pretty bleak, right? Most of the arms control architecture has crumbled and fallen away, right? We no longer have a global, a missile, INF, sorry, for our viewers who may not know the acronym SOUP, we no longer have an agreement in place to limit intermediate range missiles, right? Whether they're conventional or nuclear. That is a big problem. That is one area where we could focus on how to move forward, not just with the US and Russia, but maybe more globally. I mean, it's a laundry list of agreements that have either fallen away or, we haven't gotten around to negotiating, like a fissile material treaty. Comprehensive test ban treaty has not entered into force. So from that perspective, from an international regime perspective, it's not looking very great. The fact that we don't have a conventional forces in Europe, any kind of limits on conventional forces is also a problem. So I think what we're faced with is if it's possible, can we reconstruct, can we rebuild some of those, maybe not necessarily the same agreements, but folding in these new domains, which actually do have a huge impact on strategic stability. And it's not just going to be the big three, right? Because some of these new capabilities, as technology has diffused, are in the hands of other countries. So it's a huge challenge, I believe, but very urgent that we make some progress. I'll leave it there. And did I answer your question about NPT review conference, Sibylla?
Yes, thank you. Actually, Sharon, it's a really rich discussion, and I'm glad that this is just the first of a series of webinars, because I think we'll need many more to really go into depth about all of these issues. So it's good to throw out the whole menu, and I think this will keep us busy for some time. The way I see it now, we may not have time for more than one more round because we just have half an hour more. So I will, in the next round, invite all of you to respond to the points that were made by the other panelists and also address any questions that were specifically addressed to you. Let me also throw in one myself, forward-looking in terms of what could be done. What are your recommendations in terms of who needs to do what? And please also name the actors that need to do something. There were a number of questions that were raised by the audience. You have access to them yourself. I'll just briefly flag 5. So feel free to choose any of them in your responses. One was about nuclear negotiations, to what extent they should be different from other disarmament negotiations because of what's at stake. There was a question about no first use and any possibilities to verify. One question about how to prevent escalation. What measures the P5 could take, one about what incentives could be created for China to be engaged in arms control discussion, and finally about the obstacles and prospects to negotiating another successor agreement to New START beyond 26. So with that, over to you, and maybe I'll do it in reverse order. So I'll go back to, well, maybe not Sharon, so you don't have a chance to react. Let me go back in the original order, change of mind. Over to you, Matt.
Sure, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for those fantastic comments and questions as well. There's a lot to pick through, so I'm gonna pick and choose various things, and I'll leave some other things to my co-panelists because there's just so much. I guess one thing I wanted to pick up on was something that Ambassador Batsanov mentioned, and also I think this was actually mentioned by everyone, but this kind of growing issue between not just kind of the entanglement question between nuclear and conventional forces, but also the growing concern around the technological improvements in conventional counterforce systems that are driving instability. And just to pick up on one example with regards to China, because it's one of the themes of this panel is something notable about these new silos that are under construction is they are located deeper inside China than any other current deployments of known Chinese ICBM bases. And so they are out of the reach of US conventional cruise missiles that would be based kind of in the area on attack submarines and things like that. So it's just interesting to note, I'm assuming that kind of thinking goes into where these deployments take place, but it's notable that the improvements to conventional counterforce capabilities could be driving potentially the nature of these strategic deployments. So that's just kind of something interesting that I wanted to pick up on. Something else that I think has been mentioned a little bit, and I just wanted to emphasize again, is I think it's also important to recognize a key driver of the nuclear arms race here is the inherent links between the extremely powerful weapons industry in all of these countries, but I tend to keep a really close eye on the U.S. one in particular. And Sharon mentioned the links between like missile defense and contractors and Congress and things like that. It's sewn kind of into the fabric of U.S. modernization, American political life. That is just such a tremendous obstacle to overcome when we look at the arms race. And I think that, it does seem to me that often nuclear decisions seem to be driven, as much, if not sometimes more so, by the interests of the kind of the weapons industry than it is by national security concerns. And I think that in itself is a serious problem. And I think that, when it comes to some potential recommendations or solutions or something like that, in all of these countries, there has to be some kind of inward-looking situation where the United States, in particular, takes a close look at the relationships between these various companies, these contractors, these Congress people, administration officials, things like that, and figures out how to close some of those loopholes, because that really does tend to drive a lot of national security decision-making. And I think that sometimes we end up with systems in excess of what would be strictly needed for deterrence purposes. And I think that in itself is a problem. So I think there has to be some kind of inward-looking, procedure there. And I guess one last thing that I would say before I kind of turn it over to my fellow co-panelists is, I think something that kind of anecdotally has struck me recently is that it seems more and more frequently that nuclear armed states don't really seem to consider disarmament to be an urgent, like a humanitarian imperative or an environmental imperative or a security imperative. I would suggest it's probably all of those things, but instead it seems that in the context of the NPT, most states will consider disarmament to be instead a kind of chore that is just mandated by the NPT, and it's mandated by Article 6 and things like that. But it's not. It's the way that officials will talk about nuclear disarmament. I would say it's very rare to hear a coherent rationale for why disarmament is important, other than just the obligation to do so under the NPT. So to me, it sort of speaks to potentially a lack of seriousness about disarmament, maybe a lack of creativity, a lack of vision. But it seems also that they are increasingly focused on shifting the responsibility for disarmament onto non-nuclear weapon states by arguing that they have to first, create these security conditions that would make nuclear disarmament possible. And I think, to me, there's something that seems a little backwards about that. But those are just a bunch of thoughts that I kind of picked on from various comments. So I'm interested to hear what others think as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yes, I can also agree with the assessment that there's a lack of vision and a lack of creativity, and both of that would get us a lot further in the future. With that, I'd like to hand over to you, Sergey. Ambassador Batsanov, you're still muted.
Yes. I would start with one of the last comment by Matt Gorda about imperative to proceed to disarmament, limitations, reducing weapons, and so on. In general, I agree with that, but I would maybe try to define it a bit different. Yes, indeed. The first phase of Soviet American strategic arms limitation talks, which started in 1969, were not in 1969, many years ago now. Of course, were often shown as a kind of two countries implementing Article 6. In fact, they were politically born even before the conclusion of the NPT. And I think about primarily the most crucial engagement between Soviet Union and the US, the famous President Johnson meeting with Premier Kosygin, and their discussion about, and that was 67, yes, it was 67 in Glasgow. Was it? Yes. And they were discussing also the relationship between offensive and defensive. And it took President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara a lot of efforts to finally convince Kosygin, but he didn't confess immediately, about the wisdom of this defensive-offensive relationship and the need to limit also defensive systems. So it came out even before NPT was concluded from a certain geopolitical situation. Today, as we discussed that geopolitical situation is rapidly changing, that certain positions, leadership positions, are being threatened of certain countries. I don't think that the model for relations and for combining competition and, well, certain degree of cooperation, that model has been designed or even in very rough terms accepted by anybody. And I see several models for that great power or whatever competition. And one of them is particularly frightening to me. And this is when, again, thanks to changes in military technology, scientific technological progress, neighbors of really great powers could be used as, let's say, additional irritators for those big powers and to generate additional threats. Nobody wants to have a direct big confrontation with another huge power. But to make the life of the other guy miserable, all kinds of political military combinations are possible. And this is where I think more needs to be explored and done in order to prevent, especially if such a model wins the minds and hearts of people, how to really prevent war and minimize the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why President Putin of Russia recently asked or demanded the liberation of security guarantees for Russia in the European context. I'm not sure I like the word, but I understand the meaning of that. There is huge concern that offensive missiles, American missiles, could find their way into Ukraine, for example, or in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, with actually no approach, no time to think about what to do once they are used. It's not a surprise, it's very logical that the new Chinese positions, launching areas, are as far deep in the Chinese territory as never before. Why that? For me, it's clear to have more warning time before they are attacked, in order to decide on how to react, how to retaliate if necessary, and so on. So this is just one small example of how the new situation is really difficult to address. About China, of course, applying bilateral Soviet American, Russian American models in a trilateral context is really much more difficult, especially when we have basically Russia and China standing much closer to each other than each of them vis-a-vis the United States. And that would complicate American thinking about the situation also greatly. However, I think that on certain areas, on certain issues, the earlier bilateral process could be expanded. But those issues have to be very carefully selected. It shouldn't be about, let's say, overall nuclear force levels. I don't see how that can work, but maybe certain things can. Also, about bringing in China and the fact that China stands rather, and Russia do share a lot of common views, and don't consider each other as opponents, as enemies. That is different from the US. There are two US allies whose, let's say, links to the US are much stronger, at least from the legal point of view, than links between Russia and China, namely the UK and France. They are nuclear weapon states. They are members of NATO. They are just one alliance. So what can one do here? So from a Russian perspective, talking only about China is not enough. And by the way, talking about the UK. The UK has recently also decided to increase somewhat, not so significantly, its nuclear arsenal. I still have to see one good, coherent official explanation of that, because all explanations differ somewhat one from another. But I remember reading shortly after that decision was announced, a commentary by a very, I forgot the name now, a very high level British military officer or commander. And he said something which was not directly mentioned in other official commentaries. The Russian advances in anti-aircraft and anti-missile defenses, which is, of course, correct. There have been serious advances here. But this is when the same logic we discussed as to why China may need more nuclear weapons because of in the light of the American global missile defense, why Russia is reluctant to reduce nuclear weapons in the absence of agreement to limit and manage missile defenses and so on and so forth. Now it manifested itself coming from the United Kingdom on a smaller scale. Well, I think I should stop on that.
Thank you very much. With that, over to you, Tong.
Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief. In response to Sharon's point on fissile material, I totally agree. You know, there is growing American concern that given the existing stockpile of fissile material is a real constraint on China's potential to build up its nuclear forces. That China may be using its civilian nuclear facilities, including fast breeder reactors and reprocessing facilities to produce fissile materials for weapon program in the future. If China is not doing that, I think China should have every incentive to provide reassurance, offer more transparency to clarify this issue. My colleagues at Carnegie, James Acton, and others have proposed specific confidence building measures between US and China through which they can clarify the status of their fissile material production at civilian facilities. So this would be a good opportunity for China to clarify potential international misunderstanding about its nuclear program. Matt mentioned a very good point about risks and escalation management. I think a major challenge today is countries, politicians, decision makers, and the general public don't fully appreciate the risk of nuclear arms race and the permanent maintenance of nuclear weapons. China's reported massive procurement of DF-26 conventional nuclear dual-capable missile systems indicates that Chinese decision makers don't fully appreciate the risk of how this entangled weapon system could lead to misunderstanding in a crisis and potentially raise the risk of inadvertent escalation. Russian development of the nuclear-powered cruise missile had already suffered from incidents. The missile fall into water and produced radioactive contamination to the environment, including to people in a nearby city. So people and the environment, the ecosystem was already affected by in the process of this intensifying nuclear competition. There was an incident recently in South China Sea where a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine, the Connecticut, which collided with a sea mountain and lost power. And China really criticized this incident without appearing to understand that this is bound to happen to every country that operates nuclear submarines, especially for China, which is massively, engaging in development of sea-based nuclear capabilities, which has not developed as rich experience as US and other powers in operating nuclear submarines. It's just a matter of time that a similar incident could happen to a Chinese nuclear submarine. And by so publicly criticizing incident of another country, I think that would only leave China with one option in the future Chinese incident, which is to conceal rather than be transparent about it. And of course, nuclear incidents can be concealed, but the consequences will still be borne by the people, by the environment, by the ecosystem. So the general public need to understand that arms race is not safe at all. And we do need transparent and free public discussion debate, which is not in existence at all in some nuclear weapon states, about these important decisions around nuclear weapons. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. With that, over to you, Sharon.
Thanks. So I just want to focus on one of your questions, which was the obstacles to negotiating a follow-on to New START. And I would commend to all your watchers here, if you haven't read it yet, you should read Rose Godmiller's book on negotiating the New START treaty. It's really instructive. And the thing that I came away with was Rose had a very, very narrowly defined objective, right? And so she knew, exactly what she had to ask for, what she had to do. And even then, looking at all the challenges that she faced, shows for us, when you look at a follow-on to New START, just how tough this is going to be. When the two, so Russia and the US are at this point do not have agreement, nor one would one expect them to have any agreement on, what would go under New START. The U.S. Goals right now are quite narrow, right? They're like, well, we want to keep the limits on Russian forces. We want to bring in non-strategic nuclear weapons. Well, the Russians are not about to bring in non-strategic nuclear weapons. They have been telling us that for, a decade or more, unless the US wants to compromise on ballistic missile defenses. So the two sides are quite far apart. At the same time, the strategic stability dialogues have set up two working groups, as Ambassador Batsanov mentioned. One of those is on this, capability actions with strategic effects. That working group breaks everything wide open, right? I mean, you can talk about cyber, you can talk about space. So these talks are really, really important, but I anticipate that they are not going to result in, agreement anytime soon, unless there's a big political decision that, we have to come together on a follow-on to New START. So I'm pessimistic. I think the obstacles are very high, but the whole effort is still actually really worth putting a lot of effort into. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We're almost at the end. There are 3 more minutes. So before I conclude, I would like to actually ask each of you, since it's sort of coming to the end of the year and holiday season, if you had one wish in this field, which one would it be? Or if you had one request also from the one actor to do X, Y, and Z, what would it be? So very quick round, just 20 seconds, 30 seconds, everybody. Reverse order this time. So Sharon, over to you. Very quick thinking.
Oh my goodness. A global agreement on limiting some missile capabilities. That's what I would go for. It's a big wish.
Great, big wish. Big wishes are good. So over to you, Tang. What's your big wish?
Well, I hope US and China would follow up with their leader summit meeting and start official level track 1 dialogue on strategic stability.
Cool. And from you, Sergei?
My wish would be that all P5, and maybe in the first place, US and Russia, agree and understand the importance of paying or allocating much higher priority to military stability, non-proliferation, than to winning competition, even, against their opponents, than winning competition in other areas. So everything has to be balanced here. Thank you.
Thank you. The last wish from you, Matt.
Sure. I would say my one wish would be a global shift away from launch on warning to the extent that that's possible. I think the way that our launch systems are designed, there's too little time for decision makers to make rational decisions under such extreme time pressures with such global consequences. So I would try and extend that time as much as possible.
Thank you. I'll sneak in a last wish from me, actually building on what Ambassador Batsanov said at the beginning, that we are back to an arms race, even though we thought in the 1990s we were done with that. So an end to the nuclear arms race would be my very, very, very big wish. So with that, I'd like to extend huge thanks to the whole panel. It has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I wish we had hours more to ask more questions, but we will do that, just not today. So we'll come back to you for further events and opportunities. And since the Alva Myrdal Centre is just being set up, there'll be opportunities also to do events in that context. And there'll be an opportunity also to commemorate and do events in memory of Alva Myrdal, which we would very much invite all of you to join as well. So thanks to the panel, but then thanks also to the audience. I know it's a very busy time of year, so thanks to all of you for making time for this. And thanks to the team here at SIPRI, who's helped me prepare the event. So that is Peter, Shannon, and Tutti, and also the full tech team here at SIPRI. Thank you so much for that. With that, I'm wishing you a good rest of the day. Some of you it's late, some of you it's early. So have a good rest of the week and all the best wishes, and Happy New Year to all of you.